After the assassination of Queen Min, King Gojong was placed under Japanese surveillance. William Dai and several anti-Japanese officials attempted to rescue the king from Japanese control, but their plan failed due to the betrayal of an informant. This became known as the Chunseong Gate incident. Despite this failure, King Gojong eventually managed to take refuge in the Russian legation in Seoul, an event known as the Agwan Pakyan, the king's refuge at the Russian legation. However, Japan did not give up its ambitions and continued diplomatic pressure. 3 months later, in May 1896, Japan sent an envoy to attend the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II in St. Petersburg. At that time, Yamagata Aritomo proposed dividing the Korean peninsula. Along the 39th parallel, Japan would control the south, Russia the north, but Russian Foreign Minister Lobanov rejected the proposal, insisting that Russia has neither the intention of annexing Korea, nor of turning it into a protectorate. Ultimately, both countries agreed to establish a neutral zone, should their troops enter Korea, keeping a balance of influence. King Gojong, who had placed his trust in Russia, returned to his palace disappointed. Russia avoided entanglement in Korea to prevent another unnecessary war. Its primary focus was countering Britain's maritime dominance by building the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would allow overland access to East Asia. For Russia, a neutral and independent Korea was ideal, while Japan persistently sought interference and domination. Meanwhile, independence movements were spreading throughout Korea. Civil organizations such as the Independence Club and the All People's Association demanded the dismissal of Russian advisors. Russia accepted without resistance and withdrew, in sharp contrast to Japan's relentless intervention. Around the same time in China, the great powers took advantage of the weakened Qing dynasty. Defeated in the First Sino-Japanese War, they expanded their leased territories and concessions, exploiting China's decline. Amid this humiliation, ordinary citizens rose up. This was the Boxer Rebellion. The Empress Dowager Cixi used the uprising to her advantage, and declared war on the foreign powers under the slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigners." However, the Boxers were poorly armed and unfamiliar with modern warfare, and the rebellion was quickly suppressed. At Britain's request, Japan sent about 7,500 troops, and received financial aid in return. This marked Japan's formal entry into the ranks of the world powers. Russia, meanwhile, dispatched large forces into Manchuria, but refused to withdraw after the rebellion ended. It sought to secure an ice-free port and to expand its influence in East Asia. Ito Hirobumi attempted to reach an understanding. Japan would recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria, and Russia would recognize Japan's influence in Korea, but Russia refused, arguing that Korea itself was not a threat, yet a Japan-controlled Korea would be. For Japan, both Korea and Manchuria were indispensable. Realizing it could not act alone, Japan looked for an ally. Britain, which dominated Asian trade, also viewed Russia as a troublesome rival. In 1901, Britain proposed an alliance, but Japan hesitated, trying to secure the best possible terms. Finally, in 1902, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was signed. Both nations recognized the independence of China and Korea, and agreed to support one another if a third power threatened their interests. With this alliance, Japan gained the confidence to confront Russia directly. For Japan, Korea was a vital strategic area, one that could never be ceded to Russia. Foreign Minister Komura Jutaro proposed a mutual recognition. Japan would accept Russian interests in Manchuria, and Russia would accept Japanese interests in Korea. He further demanded that Japan hold full authority over Korea's internal reforms, but Viceroy Alexeyev, commander of Russian forces in the Far East, rejected the offer. He declared that Manchuria was outside Japan's sphere of influence, and that Korea should remain neutral. In January 1904, Russia proposed a plan for mutual economic cooperation, pledging to respect the sovereignty of both Korea and Manchuria. However, Japan dismissed the proposal. Negotiations were over. Russia's troops were scattered across its vast empire, leaving only about 40,000 soldiers in the Far East. Japan, by contrast, could mobilize more than 500,000 men. Before the Trans-Siberian Railway was fully completed, Japan needed to strike first. In truth, these negotiations were largely a diplomatic formality, a justification to show the world that Japan had been forced into war. During this tense period, Emperor Gojong declared Korea's strict neutrality. Should war break out between Russia and Japan, other major powers also declared neutrality, except the United States, which remained silent. America, pursuing expansion in the Philippines and China, viewed Russia as an obstacle to its open-door policy. Thus, the US adopted a friendly neutrality toward Japan, and warned France and Germany that, if they formed a coalition with Russia against Japan, America would side with Japan. 2 days before the war began, Japan severed diplomatic relations with Russia, and ordered a full military mobilization. Without any formal declaration of war, Japan launched a surprise attack, a move aimed at securing a quick victory against the larger Russian Empire. Emperor Gojong believed that Korea was protected by the neutrality guaranteed by other powers, but without warning, Japanese troops landed at Chinhe Bay, on the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, ignoring Korea's stance and using its territory as a springboard for invasion. Soon after, Japan presented the Korean government with a treaty, the First Japan-Korea Protocol, February 1904, effectively stripping Korea of sovereignty. Its main clauses were: 1. Korea shall accept Japan's advice in matters of administrative reform. 2. The Japanese army may freely use any area of Korean territory necessary for the war. 3. Japan guarantees the independence and territorial integrity of Korea. In form, the treaty claimed to protect Korea's independence. In reality, it was the beginning of Korea's subjugation. The Russo-Japanese War ultimately ended in victory for Japan. One of the key reasons for Japan's victory was its success in financing the war. Takahashi Kurikyo, vice governor of the Bank of Japan, raised about 1.3 billion yen through foreign bond issues. Behind this success stood Jacob Schiff, a prominent New York banker and head of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Takahashi toured London and New York, warning that Russian expansion endangered the stability of East Asia. For Schiff, a Jewish American, supporting Japan also meant opposing the anti-Semitic policies of the Russian Empire. As Japan won early victories, confidence in its bonds grew. Investors worldwide bought Japanese war bonds, allowing Japan to purchase much-needed arms and ammunition. Another major factor was the intelligence network known as the Akashi Mission. Colonel Akashi Motojiro operated across Europe, funding and encouraging Russian revolutionary movements, to undermine the morale and unity of the Tsar's forces. But perhaps the most decisive support came from Britain, Japan's ally. When the Russian Baltic Fleet set sail for East Asia, the shortest route would have been through the Suez Canal. However, since the canal was under British control, and Britain was Japan's ally, the fleet was denied passage. Forced to sail around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, it endured a long and exhausting voyage under constant British surveillance. By the time it reached East Asia, the fleet was worn out and demoralized, and it was completely destroyed by the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Tsushima. Despite enormous losses, Japan maintained its morale to the end, and emerged victorious. The largest land battle, the Battle of Mukden, saw the outnumbered Japanese forces encircle and defeat the Russian army. At sea, Admiral Tojo Hihochiro crushed the Baltic fleet at Tsushima, through a daring maneuver, the famous Tojo Turn. Following these victories, Japan requested mediation from U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Russia, initially reluctant to admit defeat, eventually agreed to peace talks under international pressure. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, granted Japan a protectorate over Korea, the lease of Port Arthur and Dalian, control of the railway south of Changchun, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and fishing rights along Russia's Pacific coast. However, no indemnity was awarded. Russia insisted that there is neither victor nor vanquished, and refused to pay compensation. Japan had no choice but to accept. The Japanese people, who had endured forced war bonds, heavy taxes, and sent their sons to battle while living under severe austerity, were enraged to learn there would be no reparations. The government had hidden the truth, that Japan had barely scraped by to win. On the day of the treaty's signing, Thousands gathered in Hibiya Park in Tokyo, shouting, "Down with the humiliating peace." Their protest turned violent, leading to the Hibiya riots, one of the first mass uprisings in modern Japan. Years later, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in his 2015 statement on the 70th anniversary of the war's end, remarked, "Japan's victory over Russia inspired courage among the peoples of Asia and Africa." Indeed, many colonized nations saw in Japan proof that a non-Western country could defeat a white imperial power. Yet Jawaharlal Nehru, future Prime Minister of India, later wrote bitterly, "The Russo-Japanese War merely added another imperialist power, Japan, to the group of aggressor nations, and the first to taste its bitter result was Korea." Japan's triumph thus became both a symbol of hope for oppressed nations, and the prelude to a new age of Asian imperialism.